Thank you, Dave, so much for joining us. It is such a privilege to have you on with us. Hearing some of the projects that you have worked on, I honestly feel like I'm amongst Microsoft royalties.
Hey, I'm Dave. Welcome to my balcony. I'm actually on vacation this weekend. That's why there's been no new video. Unlike some creators, I'm not smart enough to bank content in advance. However, by serendipitous coincidence this week, Microsoft had reached out to me in order to prepare a presentation for one of their internal engineering groups, which I agreed to do on the condition that I'd be able to record it for you, as well as a Q&A at the end of the session. So I've edited them up. Here they are. I hope you enjoy them. Following the main session, there's a Q&A moderated by Molly McCarthy of Microsoft, and I think you'll find that interesting as well. I hope you find it some combination of informative and entertaining, and I hope to see you next week back here in the shop, or back in my shop.
Hey, I'm Dave. Welcome to my shop. I'm Dave Plummer, a retired operating systems engineer from Microsoft, going back to the MS-DOS and Windows 95 days. And today, I'm here to tell you a few cautionary tales from the non-visible portion of the spectrum, which is to say, from long before I even knew that I had autism. I recently completed writing a book that covers a wide range of autism topics, such as emotions, empathy, mind blindness, marriage, relationships, friendships, parenting, employment, and a number of others. But it's that last one, employment, that I will spend the most time talking to you about today. That's because it's something else we may very well have in common. I spent a little more than a decade as a developer at Microsoft, but it was way back in the 90s, which was a very different time, at least culturally. As we explore the topic, I'll adapt shifting vantage points to look at things not only from the perspective of the employee with autism, but also from that of the manager with autism. And we'll look at things from the other side as well. What you should know about working for a manager with autism or with a coworker that's on the spectrum. Odds are you'll find yourself in one of those quadrants every so often. Our chat will make use in part of anecdotes drawn from my book, which is titled, well, I cringe a little bit every time I think about the title, as it's a pure piece of clickbait. Secrets of the Autistic Millionaire. Like we're going to be counting cards or predicting what day of the week you were born on for fun and profit. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint, but about the only impressive autistic superpower that I possess may be playing Tempest at a championship level. I've held the world record on it for about 40 years now. My walk with autism began at birth, of course, and yet I was largely oblivious to my own condition for more than 50 years. And then, one day, a trusted friend and mentor named Ben called and invited me for lunch. Ben had been my first manager at Microsoft, hiring me to come in and work on MS-DOS back in the early 90s, right after graduation from the University of Regina. We had both long since retired and moved on from Microsoft, and I had not seen him in several years. At some point along the way, he had been surprised by a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder for his own adult daughter, and apparently, after better seeing and understanding the symptoms and seeing them in the context of his own family, one of his early thoughts was Dave should get himself tested. Soon after, he invited me for lunch and told me about his daughter's diagnosis, and without really being specific at all as to why, he encouraged me to investigate being tested for autism myself. Long story short, I went home and took the Autism Spectrum Quotient test online, and of a possible 50 points, I scored 40. Clearly, I thought, I must be answering the questions with some kind of personal bias, so I had my wife of 25 years sit down and make sure I was being accurate and honest. I retook the test with her to be sure that I did not exaggerate, and my score went up, 42. For years, I had joked that I'm not on the spectrum, but you can see it from here. And later upgraded that to, well, I might be on the spectrum, but I'm on the non-visible portion. Still, I didn't really consider it possible. I'm empathetic, sensitive, emotional, and funny, all things that I thought would preclude me from being anywhere on the autism spectrum. I booked the necessary appointments, and over the course of the next few weeks, completed all the testing. Being Canadian originally, I'd never written the SAT before, and I would have done a little better with a little advanced practice, but going in cold as an adult was also interesting in its own right. It sure had been a long time since I'd done much long division. Preparing the full report took a few weeks, and my wife accompanied me to receive the results. I was officially diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder that day. As the neurologist, my wife and I flipped through the pages of the report in unison. Terms like significant social dysfunction stared back at me. When we finally got to the autism-specific behaviors section, my wife was pleased to note, well, at least the numbers are good here, far above average. But then the doctor corrected her. No, higher is worse. I used to be gifted, but now I had a diagnosis, and it had a better and a worse, and that's about all I felt in those initial minutes. As with any condition that one finds themselves troubled by, I became curious. How did I come to have autism? There are no environmental triggers or causes known. I'd been vaccinated as a child, but the link that had once been fraudulently asserted between vaccines and autism had long ago been so fully discredited that I gave that no serious consideration. That really only left one thing: genetics. While autism does indeed seem to have its roots in our genes, the heritability of autism is complex, and no one knows specifically which genes contribute to the condition. It's also possible that environmental factors work in concert with genetics and epigenetics to form a cause. Some have speculated that autism is perhaps an overrepresentation of technical genes. These genes are likely the very same ones that led to the discovery of stone tools, fire, and other early technologies. As author Temple Grandin has written, without these genes, the human race might still be socializing around campfires. Now, if you're an autistic kid who likes dinosaurs, you are likely very interested in dinosaurs. Very, very interested. You will come to know all the names, all the facts, everything pertinent to their existence and extinction. As you accumulate this knowledge, it feels somehow practical and valuable and hence rewarding, as though there was an imperative driving you forward to accumulate and organize this knowledge. It's like assembling the final few pieces of a complicated puzzle, and it generates a similar satisfaction as those pieces fall into place. For me, it has been computers for most of my life. I wandered into a Radio Shack store in about 1979 when I was 11 and saw my very first computer. It was not connected, and the staff had not yet figured out how to set it up. So, being somewhat precocious, I asked whether they might let me play with it if I could manage to connect it all up. On a lark, they said, "Sure, kid, have a shot," and 10 minutes or so later, I had it up and running. This endeared me to the manager, Brian, so much so that every Thursday night and Saturday morning, I would ride my bike down to the store and I'd type in my crude basic programs, and they would be kind enough to indulge my incessant tinkering on their expensive computer. Soon I was also riding my bike across the city to sneak into the University of Regina Computer Labs, where I had managed to set up an account on the PDP-11 named Minerva. When I started high school in 1982, I did so as part of a new and experimental gifted program being launched in my hometown. That program provided what was perhaps my first major diagnostic clue in the autism puzzle, but we would all miss it at the time: aptitude testing. Each of us in the class was rigorously tested in several ways to best determine where our aptitude lay. When the results came in, my future careers were to be chicken farmer or mortician. Since neither career was actually in the slightest way compelling to me, neither my parents nor the school placed much weight on those results, but they're interesting now since the people in those professions spend very little time socially interacting with other people. Perhaps a career working alone with the deceased or with chickens is no more surprising than the career I ultimately did pick, working alone with a machine. Unfortunately, the attrition rate for the gifted program was high. Kids dropped out of the program rapidly, and within a few years, there wasn't a sufficient quorum of us left to form a class. So we were dispersed and mainstreamed back into the general population, for better or worse. In my own case, it was for the worse. I dropped out of high school entirely shortly thereafter. I was 17, so after working a string of jobs ranging from 7-Eleven cashier to assembly language game programmer, I eventually returned 4 years later and completed my 12th grade at the ripe old age of 21. From there, it was on to college, then an internship at Microsoft, and then finally a full-time position there upon graduating, meaning that in the course of this very paragraph, I dropped out of high school, got married, immigrated to the USA, got a job at Microsoft, and then spent a decade in the Windows operating system division. Well, even I can't fast-forward an entire career at Microsoft. But to keep it brief, I started at MS-DOS, where I wrote smart drive CD caching, and then I wrote single-pass disk copy, the new setup, and I worked on doublespace. After a brief stint in OLECOM, I moved to the NT Shell team where we ported the Win95 user interface over to NT4 and MIPS and RISC and Alpha, which in turn became NT4, XP, 2000, and so on through Windows 11 today. Somewhere along the way, I started writing the Windows Task Manager and the zip folder feature at home in my den, and those two wound up as parts of Windows as well. I also volunteered to do the Windows port of the classic pinball game we all know and love and the first versions of the Windows Media Center. Before I left, I wrote the first versions of Windows Product Activation and then retired after XP and Server 2003. With my diagnosis not coming until after I retired from Microsoft, it goes without saying that I spent my entire career largely oblivious to the fact that I was different. In part, this is because Microsoft had so many other people that also exhibited autism symptoms that it really meant I fit in quite well most times. But to put it another way, it was easy to hide in plain sight there. Although there were a great number of people not unlike me, having autism still made for a complicated landscape when it came to social interaction and management. Microsoft was very much an email culture, and thus most of what we did every day could be done without face-to-face interaction, but even so, the deficits in social communication that accompany autism became problematic for me. In my early days there, I would estimate that perhaps a quarter of the workforce at Microsoft was noticeably on the spectrum. At that time, most of the management was comprised of former developers who had been promoted to positions of leadership based largely on their technical achievements, which was also the situation in my own case. This promotion of technically successful programmers meant that a lot of supervisors and leads were possibly on the spectrum as well. Being an employee with autism can be challenging, particularly if you're not open about it or if you are simply oblivious to it. The sometimes flat affect can cause others to jump to conclusions. People who had really not even met me would assume that I was insubordinate or rude or sarcastic until they got to know me. But some, like our local distinguished engineer, simply flipped the bit on me as being irredeemably grumpy. People with autism can take and deliver expressions too literally, be too blunt, make pointed remarks, and appear aloof or detached at times. We can also react with inappropriate reactions, such as smiling under intense stress. These things can complicate any relationship, but are especially problematic in a coworker where the relationship is different from that of a family or friend if for no other reason than the other person's presence is not entirely voluntary. Here are just a few of the basic ways in which autism can impact on-the-job performance. Not each one is always a negative, but they all can have negative implications, such as a failure to make eye contact, smile, or follow other common social conventions. Interrupting, talking too slowly, quickly, loudly, or quietly. Missing sarcasm and taking things too literally. There can be a lack of flexibility, always needing to have something done a certain way. Unintentionally offending others with honest and direct statements. Continuing to discuss a topic long past its freshness date, or continuing to ask questions in a meeting after it's clear that question time is over. Now, this isn't a case of simply talking to be seen in the meeting. Let's say that an important decision hinges on 5 unknowns. Once 3 of them are addressed, enough is known that perhaps the decision can then be made. But the person with autism will press for answers on the 2 remaining unknowns because we lack central coherence or the ability to see the forest for the trees. We not only focus on the trees, but we can obsess over branches and individual pine cones sometimes as well. We can sometimes speak to supervisors, managers, and even customers without the typical or appropriate deference for the situation. People with autism are rarely starstruck. They value different things and might care only about a person's placement on some particular competence hierarchy. Except for Mr. Spock and maybe Richard Feynman, being highly famous or highly placed within the company doesn't seem to carry the same weight for us as it does for the neurotypical. Some may have problems controlling their anger or frustration, and some may be gullible and subject to exploitation. Now, I don't know what I don't know. I feel like this doesn't apply to me, but I'm sure everyone believes themselves to be sufficiently skeptical. Still, we're at a marked disadvantage playing games in the social engineering arena. We may end conversations sometimes by simply turning or walking away when they've run their course. We may need breaks in long meetings to decompress periodically. The reality is that being social or being in a meeting, dealing with people, masking, and putting on a show is draining, and if you do it for 30 to 45 minutes or an hour, then you kind of need a break to recharge, and then you can come back and do some more. But unlike for the neurotypical folks, it's not something that comes natural, so it's a fair bit of work. Now, there can also be a tendency to assign blame during conflict resolution, because establishing cause and identifying how to prevent a recurrence seem to be paramount to the autistic individual, but it can seem like petty finger pointing in the moment. They may be unable to successfully navigate office politics. So my best advice is to make friends with a neurotypical person who's in the gossip loop and therefore can become your neurotypical whisperer of some kind. And lastly, we either have messy desks or are super particular about the order of our incredibly neat desks. Lacking central coherence means that it's hard to know how to get from big mess to clean. So either your desk degenerates into chaos or you implement a strict set of orderly rules to prevent it from ever getting that way. And if the red swingline stapler is supposed to go on the left side of the desk, please put it back there when you're done with it. And don't flip on the fluorescent lights when you walk in or randomly rearrange things on my desk. Now then, if employees that have autism face so many challenges, why would a company such as Microsoft be so highly populated with them? Well, there are many reasons why someone with autism can be a highly valuable employee. These are, again, generalizations and don't apply to every individual with autism symptoms, but in broad terms. They can have very strong analytical and logical skills. Their lack of social filters can be valuable sometimes for unvarnished truths. They usually have deep specialized knowledge in their field of expertise. They seem to crave knowing all there is to know for its own sake. They can use creative problem solving. They have different tool sets and can often solve problems that others could not because they bring a unique mental perspective to the table. They are often highly technically able. They have incredible mental perseverance in solving problems. In other words, it's not over when I'm tired, it's over when I've figured it out. Many have an excellent memory with attention to detail and excellent recall. An eidetic memory can come in handy sometimes. There's a love of structure, order, and even repetition. Common traits include honesty, loyalty, predictability, and reliability. And that's not because they're ethically superior in some way, it's just that's what works with them because they really don't like change and surprise. So they thrive on routine as well. They are highly accountable to dates and milestones and take them very literally. They're often very self-motivated and driven to do well at whatever they're passionate about. In general, as a personality trait, they're often highly conscientious. The inclusion of lack of a social filter as a positive here might surprise you, as it's truly a double-edged sword. It's a powerful ability to see through the social haze of niceties and extract the sometimes inconvenient or painful truth. Consider the parable of the emperor's new clothes. Odds are the child who saw the emperor as he really was and who felt compelled to point out everyone else's mistake was on the spectrum. It's the ability to say what everyone else should be thinking but is afraid to say. Not because you're a sassy waitress from a 1970s sitcom, but because people with autism are less likely to go along to get along if doing so involves a logical contradiction or willfully overlooking a factual mistake, because both seem incredibly uncomfortable. Neurotypical people, particularly those with high central coherence, like to organize their tasks and work into neat groups and tie them up with a little bow, whereas those with autism tend to have weaker coherence and can tend to get bogged down in the details. Difficulties with central coherence may manifest themselves as difficulty with organization, such as trouble getting started because they don't know where to begin. They may construct a plan and then become flustered when they are inevitably derailed from it. They sometimes have difficulty following multi-step directions or plans, particularly if those plans are not very crisp. They often need assistance in setting priorities to organize tasks and deliverables. They're often not able to accurately estimate how long a project should take. Not that anybody else is any better at that, I would guess, but they can become overwhelmed by interruptions and annoyances. They can become too rigorously locked into a particular plan or way of thinking. They may act impulsively too early on before a complete plan is formulated, and they may ask too many clarifying questions in meetings. Clearly, there's no one template, and any such challenges and complications are not limitations. The key, I believe, is for any manager with autism is to make the effort to accommodate all the various personality, learning, and operational styles in your organization. What works for your personality will likely not be an effective strategy for managing others. Your own needs are almost certainly very different from the neurotypical employee, so using them to predict what your staff needs would be foolish indeed. Once I had accepted that people had very different styles in terms of how they operated within the company and what they needed for affirmation and direction, I could adapt my management to each employee for their own unique needs and style, or at least I could try. If I had it all to do over again, and if my autism were serious enough to be noticeable to my subordinates, as mine is, I believe, and if at the time I enjoyed the luxury of knowing that I had autism, I would certainly tell my direct reports that I was on the spectrum. Why? Because I think knowing the context of why my reactions are sometimes going to be different than other managers can be helpful. One of the biggest challenges for a new manager with autism is a shift away from their area of expertise. In my case, I went from a highly technical role to a management role. Dealing with the social and personal issues of a group of employees is very different than solving a technical challenge off in a corner by yourself. Dealing well with irrationality might be completely new to you. Office politics can also be a challenge, as when you move up the corporate ladder, you wind up operating in a new political sphere as well, whether you realize it or not. Another option is to simply resist the drift into management if you can do so without scuttling your career financially. Even in a company as technically focused as Microsoft, there was an almost inexorable push towards management as you went up the career ladder. I say almost, however, because for those with the technical ability to pull it off, an individual contributor role, where they remain technically focused, might be a better choice. It's a more demanding path technically, but for certain personality types, the most rewarding. After all, when I was a kid riding my bike down to Radio Shack, it was because I was fascinated with computers and programming, not with meetings and PowerPoint presentations. If you're working with someone you believe has autism, particularly if you are neurotypical, you're going to face several unique challenges. But how can you even know whether your boss is on the spectrum, especially if they've never been tested? One cannot assume that every introverted technical person has autism. It's simply not the case. And so the reality is that you may only suspect that your boss is on the spectrum without ever being able to confirm it authoritatively. Imagine for a moment that your boss has a diagnosis and has been kind enough to inform you of it. Then you can begin to try to make the necessary adjustments. The problem is, without really knowing the person, how can you know which kinds of things are important to them or that they might be sensitive about? Are there things you can do to increase the odds of your success, such as not wearing strong perfume or cologne to work perhaps, or not flipping on fluorescent lights in their office every time you walk in, or rearranging the things on their desk in a new way? Did I already mention that? If your boss has autism and their eye contact is affected, keep in mind that the normal signals one might read from inconsistent eye contact, such as intimidation or disinterest, don't apply. Those with autism have their own cadence to their eye contact, depending on how significant their symptoms are and how hard they've worked or not worked to address it. So don't take it personally. People with autism are often much more literal about what they say than others. To that end, you too should say what you mean and mean what you say. Be literal yourself. Take dates and facts seriously as they do. If you regularly pepper your speech with sarcasm and irony, you might have to dial that back for your boss. A dry wit in particular can be misread entirely. You may also have to resolve yourself to some brutally honest feedback. A manager with autism may not couch his or her negative feedback as gently as a neurotypical manager would. You will need to receive it as it is intended, a factual evaluation and not a personal slight. As a generalization, they tend to avoid being passive-aggressive. Positive feedback from a manager with autism can be the sweetest currency of all because you know it's so literal and direct. Praise from a manager with autism probably results from a job well done and not some attempt to manipulate you. Now, it's a provocative statement, but I think accurate to say that people with autism are in general less mature emotionally. We absolutely have the same full range of emotions that anyone does, but we have trouble sometimes controlling exaggerated swings in response to sufficiently strong stimuli. It can also take time for the mental chemicals of having been overstimulated to clear. Microsoft in the 1990s was a different kind of place. It's the only place where I've worked where people would, albeit very rarely, throw things in meetings, up to and including their laptops and even chairs. Never at people though, just off into the distance out of frustration. It's happened when people that I guess or suspect may have been on the spectrum became too worked up. It's rarely from a single emotional injury, but in a long and contentious meeting over a difficult topic, that strain can accumulate. Everyone has their limit, and I submit that the limits for people with ASD are simply set much lower when it comes to being emotionally upset. A manager with autism might also seem rude at times, not using proper deference towards their upper management or interrupting conversations to get a point in, simply walking away from a conversation when their part is done, and so on. These are deficiencies in their social abilities to be sure, but you'd be better to not take them personally because they're not intended as such. They are truly oversights from not knowing better or not understanding why such things are deemed important by the neurotypical. Odds are that as you spend time working for someone with autism, you will come to find that there are a few things, like punctuality or order perhaps, that seem disproportionately important to them. What those things are vary from one individual to the next, but those with autism tend to hold a few core concepts in very high regard, such as perhaps the notion that punctuality is a direct placeholder for respect. If you are perpetually tardy, a manager with autism may come to see that as disrespect or even insubordination, depending on how passionate they are about it. To you, it might be a simple 5-minute delay at the beginning of meetings, but to them, it might be symbolic of the entire relationship between the two of you. Assuming they will get over it and move on is a poor bet. They tend not to. Finally, I'd like to turn my attention to things that Microsoft could do to make life for those on the spectrum easier when interviewing and working at Microsoft. I think the interview process is key because it's the great filter that decides who winds up as an employee in the first place. By the way, I'm basing these comments on experiences that are nearly 30 years old now, so it's quite possible that things have long since changed. If so, it's merely a vindication that I was right. For me, the interview process was as demanding as working there. Travel is hard on me to begin with, since it's a great deal of change from your regular routine, you're out of your zone of control, and particularly, since I was crossing borders and trying to obtain a work visa, your fate is handed to the capricious nature of whether your immigration officer has had an argument with his or her spouse that morning. I don't like change, and I don't like having my destiny outside of my own control, and both are magnified during the whole process. The biggest change I can recommend for the interview day is to give candidates rest breaks. Dealing with new people drains me, and the more interactive I have to be, the more recovery time I need. Rather than walking a candidate directly from 1 hour-long interview to the next, a 10-minute break in between 45-minute interviews would go a long way for somebody like me. Perhaps the lunch interview could be replaced with a 30-minute coffee social and then a 30-minute break, as such forced socialization is often more demanding than rewarding, and the time could be better spent for some of us sitting in the cafeteria with earbuds watching YouTube or doing whatever it is that they do to recharge. Now, it may come as no surprise to you that I'm a big fan of the individual office. But since that's not the reality for most folks, where you sit in an open floor plan matters all the more. Perhaps a desk facing a window or a wall is better for you than being in the middle of a chaotic office facing outwards. One of the perks of being blessed with my own office was that I could turn off the fluorescent lights, which I've now mentioned 3 times, I guess, instead using incandescent lamps in an indirect manner. If that's not an option where you are, then being closer to a source of natural light might help. Discuss these matters with your boss, whatever is important and really meaningful to you, preferably before the next big move. The issues surrounding employment and autism are many and complex, and we have but touched the surface of a topic that could easily support an entire book on its own. Ultimately, the goal should be to have an individual with autism fully engaged in their passion in such a way that their goals are aligned with those of the company. With those aligned, much of the rest will begin to fall into place as long as care and attention are paid to the many emotional, social, and interpersonal relationships that are created along the way, both with other employees and with customers. Now, I'm currently traveling internationally, so this may very well be hit or miss, but if all goes according to plan and the stars align, as soon as I wrap this up, we'll go to the live Q&A. Either way, I'd like to thank you for joining me virtually out here in the shop today. If you're interested in getting a copy of my book, Secrets of the Autistic Millionaire, it's available on Amazon where you can read the sample chapter, Burgers with Bill Gates, for free, and the ebook is on sale for under $10, so check it out. If you're interested in more content related to old Microsoft history, check out my YouTube channel called Dave's Garage, where you can watch episodes such as The Secret History of Task Manager and Why Our Blue Screen's Blue. In the meantime and in between time, I hope to see you next time, right here in Dave's Garage. Now stay tuned for the live Q&A.
I have had the good privilege of watching that video a handful of times, and every time I do, Dave, I learn something new. So I'm certain I'm not the only one with questions, so let's go right into the Q&A. First question. A team member offers that this person has had, quote, probable ASD diagnosis for years, and this person emphasizes that everything that you have said applies to her. Are there perhaps advantages to having a formal diagnosis, or is just knowing it enough?
I think there are. One of the things you've got to keep in mind is that even though you may have 90% of overlap with, say, the symptoms, if they don't rise to a level of a disorder for you, then you would not have autism disorder. So if you can manage or have your symptoms accommodated by the people around you and do everything fine, then you probably would not benefit from a diagnosis. But in my case, I had a lot of things that I don't think I was aware that I shared with other people on the autism spectrum. So I knew there were all this bag of characteristics and traits that made me kind of unique and idiosyncratic. And I'd say that's 60% of what made up my autism symptoms. But there was another 40% that I was kind of oblivious to and didn't know anything about, really. So I learned a great deal just from the diagnosis and my research subsequent to it.
Yeah, interesting. And you talk in the video too, where you spoke with your former colleague and kind of at that point decided to be tested. How might you suggest one of us potentially approach one of our colleagues who might be exhibiting similar traits, but yet may not be aware? But of course, we want to support them, but we don't want to offend them. Any coaching on that?
Well, I think, offensively comes about depending on motive, right? And I think the motive is important for why you're bringing it up. And if the person that you're conveying it to actually is mind blind, they're only going to be able to simulate what they imagine you might be thinking. So you might as well just tell them, and hopefully it's a positive thing. Because in my case, it was a family member of his, so I knew that it was coming from a kind place. Or if you know somebody else that maybe has similar symptoms, that person that works in your field that is on the spectrum, you can maybe draw equivalence to that and say, have these similar traits and they've benefited from finding out and so on and so forth. So really that matters why you're telling the person. You certainly don't want it to be that, well, now we finally know what's wrong with you. You don't want to go with that approach. So it really matters, I think, the why you're telling the person. And if that comes through honestly, I think you'll be okay.
So approach in the spirit of allyship and certainly not an accusation. That makes sense. You have lived much of your life before your diagnosis. Are you willing to share a little bit more comment around kind of your biggest or most beneficial relationship shifts since your diagnosis and kind of how that's impacted how you think about those relationships?
Right. I think the biggest change for me has been in the really close interpersonal relationships with my spouse and with my kids. And the reason there is that's where I am going to have the most idiosyncratic behavior, I think, that's going to come out in a way that's going to require the most accommodation. And I mean little things even, like I have a place in the house that I sit on a sofa, kind of like Sheldon on Big Bang Theory. He's got his place and I've got mine. But for years, I had no idea that when I went to my in-laws, I also always sat in the same place and they always just accommodated me because I just always did that. So there's been a lot of cases where now I understand what's going on and I can either adjust my own behavior or request accommodation from the family. And a great example of that is going to Disneyland as an example. It's tough for me to be on and enthusiastic and ebullient for 8 hours with Mickey and the kids. So it's great for me now if we can go for 4 hours in the morning. I go back to the hotel for an hour at lunch and check mail or do whatever I want to do and have a break by myself and then come back and spend the rest of the day. And that's a new accommodation. So the closer you are to me, the more I have benefited from knowing, I would say.
Interesting. And you spoke about giving people breaks in the interview process and that. So definitely seeing the theme. You are in front of a big group of people from Microsoft today, but of course, Microsoft is even bigger outside of this team. Do you have any recommendations on how companies, of course, Microsoft, might create a safe space for colleagues to share their diagnoses and potentially alleviate any concerns they might have about being branded or career progression implications or things like that? Any lessons to share?
It's hard for me to guess there because I didn't really have any accommodations because I didn't know that I needed any from Microsoft at the time.
Okay.
But had I known at the time, there would have been certain things that I would have said, like if we're in a 3-hour meeting, let's pretend I smoke cigarettes and I got to go out every 45 minutes or something like that.
Yeah.
To come up with some kind of reason to take little breaks. And I think the biggest thing is that and this is on the company side, that if somebody does require an accommodation, it shouldn't be seen as a benefit that they're getting that others don't need. And it shouldn't be seen as a demand, like this person must always sit near natural light and therefore must always have a window or that kind of thing. So as long as you're not seen as demanding, I think, and this is something that I need for accommodation of these symptoms, then how to avoid the stigma long-term career, I don't really know if that's still a problem in the industry or not. So it may well be.
Openness with your manager and with your colleagues seems to be what's worked really well for you.
Yeah, now that I know, it's certainly true.
Yeah. So, question around kind of emotional intelligence or the perception of emotional intelligence. If someone sees things in a very literal or binary fashion, sometimes I think there's a general sentiment of being able to, or of applying a lesson of low IQ or low EQ, so to speak. So how can we help, each other better understand and accept the emotional side of human interaction, and help those who are interacting with that person better to understand them better and set them up to be more successful? I think we think of that as allyship. Once we know, how can we as individuals make changes to our own behaviors?
Well, I think one thing is to be truly selective about those cases where emotions actually matter in a business context. But when they do, and there absolutely are cases where they do, it can be promotion related, it can be any number of things can come up. And I think it's important in that case that the communication is sometimes even pedantic to the level of this is why it's important to Bob that you go to his barbecue on the weekend or whatever the issue is. Because the double empathy problem with autism is that it's not that autistic people lack empathy, it's that they lack the communication skills to obviously or intuitively know what other people are thinking. So once they understand, they experience all the same emotions and empathy and everything else, but they don't get it naturally. Or they get the emotions naturally, but they don't get the communication naturally. So the big thing is to carefully explain the why, I think, of the situation so that they can understand it logically.
Yeah, interesting. Last one is actually more of a comment. Thank you, Dave, for sharing your story. As a parent of someone on the spectrum, your insights are really hitting home and providing new ideas for helping him reach his potential. So I share that with you just to give you a moment to potentially comment on that and help you see the value we're getting is not just through the business lens, but obviously the personal lens as well.
Right. I really appreciate that. One thing that I think is probably true is that even though initially I thought that my experience would only apply to people at a very similar level of functioning to mine, and that's not a term I use a lot, but in this case I think it makes sense. But what I have found is that the symptoms that I experience are, very broad across the spectrum. So the things that I've learned about it probably apply at a much wider range than you might even imagine. At least it surprised me, I think.
Yeah. Well, this is the very first conversation in this kind of realm that we are having this discussion. So I am sure that I speak for myself as well as the rest of my team members, recognizing that this is probably the first of more to come. With that in mind, there is a ton of information in Dave's book. And reminder, it's called Secrets of the Autistic Millionaire, Everything I Now Know About Autism and Asperger's That I Wish I Had Known Then. It's available on Amazon in both hard copy and virtual. So on behalf of the team, Dave, I just want to underscore my gratitude and thanks. So I appreciate your time.
Well, thanks very much for having me.
Absolutely.